Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Rivera, and I'm a conference content programmer for MJBiz and your host for today's webinar, The Evolution of Vertical Farming. We would first like to thank our webinar sponsor, Pipp Horticulture, for putting together today's presentation. Joining us, we have Pipp's Director of Cultivation, Michael Williamson, and their Cannabis Operations Specialist, Anders Peterson. Michael and Anders will discuss the evolution of indoor vertical cannabis farms, from the early adoption of multi-tier nurseries by legacy growers to the cutting-edge vertical farms of today. After the presentation, Michael and Anders will be available to answer questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A box below for questions. Those questions will be addressed by Michael and Anders after the presentation. Let's get started, guys.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Michael Williamson, and I am the Director of Cultivation for Pipp Horticulture and also the co-founder for Greenhouse Industries, now a division of Pipp Horticulture. And in short, I am a legacy licensed owner-operator who is celebrating my 14th year in the regulated cannabis industry. What a long, strange trip it's been. But ultimately, I'm very passionate about the plant, the people, and the technology that have been evolving and surrounding around the plant. And I'm very grateful for companies like MJBizCon for putting on webinars and platforms like this. And thank you for sharing your time with us today as participants.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for joining today. Really appreciate it. I'm Anders Peterson, Cannabis Operations Specialist here at Pipp Horticulture. Similar to Michael, I'm a legacy cannabis cultivator and have a background in molecular biology. For about the past decade, I've been involved in indoor cultivation, specifically designing and building facilities, operating them, and helping develop new products for cultivators to progress the field. So excited to share with you today about vertical farming and kind of take you through the journey. So why are we actually talking about the evolution of vertical farming today? Beyond the obvious space efficiency benefits that vertical farming provides, we thought this was a good point in time to take a step back and kind of share with you where vertical farming came from, how it's progressed, how it's innovated, where we are today, and kind of where we see it going in the future. Vertical farming is a hot topic. It's discussed quite a bit now in agriculture and horticulture as a solution to many of the problems our world faces today. Things like the ever-growing population, the loss of arable land, climate change, limited resources. And with vertical farming practices, we can produce more consistent crops year-round, closer to the consumer, limiting that food mile, and with less water, fertilizer, pesticides, and space. And so we're going to discuss this brief history of vertical farming, how cannabis legalization has spurred the adoption of innovation in this space, the progression of vertical racking designs, like how the rooms have actually progressed, and then where vertical farming is today and our predictions for the future. So let's get into it. So as we think of vertical farming as a very modern, highly technology-driven practice, the first example of vertical farming actually dates back almost 2,600 years ago. We see examples in history such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a man-made oasis in the middle of the desert, almost 60 feet tall, with advanced irrigation systems that can pump water 60 feet into the air, plants from around the world. And then 1,000 years ago, we see the Aztec floating gardens, or what were called the chinampas. And this was the first hydroponic raft style form of agriculture. And we see other various examples throughout history too. Michael, I know you had some down in South America as well.
Yeah, if we look at, for me, that vertical farming is a bit of a catch-all phrase. There's lots of different agricultural styles and approaches that will kind of fall and have been kind of, huddled under the term vertical farming. But if you really look at, there's a common theme between all those different strategies, and it's essentially to maximize and utilize square and cubic space and increase yield. And you're really working with kind of what you have. So your infrastructure, that could be the land, it could be equipment, and it could be tools. So making the most out of what you have with the resources that are available. And we see multiple examples of this throughout history. Some of them are very, very simple. And some of them, as Anders was highlighting, are really complex given the time and the technology available. If I go to like a really primitive, simple version of vertical farming, I would say it kind of correlates to a technique that the Iroquois and the Cherokee use, which is commonly referred to as Three Sisters or Three Sisters agriculture. And the Iroquois and the Cherokee, they called corn, bean, and squash the Three Sisters because they nurture each other like a family when they're planted together. And the corn is planted in small hills with beans planted around them and interspersing squash or sometimes pumpkin throughout the field. And the beans naturally absorb atmospheric nitrogen from the air and convert it to nitrates, fertilizing the soil for the corn and the squash. In return, the beans are vertically supported because they wind around the corn stalks. And the squash leaves provide ground cover between the corn and beans, preventing weeds and creating insulation for the soil in hot and cold climates. And so these three plants thrive together better when planted versus when planted alone. Another different example of vertical farming, it really comes to what is now the modern day Philippines, but they say that it's arguable, but they say that it was about 2,000 to 6,000 years ago. And I'm referencing the Banau rice terraces. And these terraces were carved into the mountains. They were located 5,000 feet above sea level. They're not exactly sure, but it seems that they were carved by hand. They were built mostly with minimal equipment, and they were fed by an ancient gravity-fed irrigation system from the rainforest above the terraces. That's the image in your bottom left-hand corner. Mm-hmm. So, vertical farming is, like I said, it's a bit of a catch-all phrase. We're in this modern time of vertical farming, but we've seen people use aspects of vertical farming for thousands of years now.
Mm-hmm. And the term vertical farming wasn't actually coined until 1915 by an American geologist, Gilbert Bailey. He was studying an alternative way to increase farm area and produce quality crops. And a lot of this thought experiment and ingenuity was driven by World War I. What was interesting about this book that you see on the right-hand side of the slide, Vertical Farming by Gilbert Bailey, was he instead of growing up from the ground up into the sky, he had an idea of blasting holes into the ground with low-cost explosives, produced during World War I, and growing plants underground in tunnels as a way to protect them and shield them from the war, and also locate them closer to dense urban areas, which is a really interesting concept, going down instead of going up. Then we saw examples of more modern vertical farming concepts being developed in the 1950s, right at the beginning of the Cold War and the beginning of the space race. A lot of greenhouse and hydroponic systems are being innovated and developed during this time, largely driven by space innovation and the space race. Like countries were trying to develop technologies that could get them a leg forward, and not only agriculture and horticulture, but space exploration as well. We saw a lot of that development happening in Armenia in the 50s. And then it wasn't until the 1990s when a Columbia professor, Dixon Despommier, who is considered the father of modern vertical farming, he saw vertical farming as the answer to bringing food production nearer to these consumers and reducing the carbon footprint, increasing sustainability. He asked his classes at Columbia for almost 9 years to go through this thought experiment with them of, hey, how do we feed all of Manhattan? How do we feed all of New York? And how do we do it in this dense urban area? And they started running calculations and scenarios of, well, how tall of a skyscraper would we need? What if we planted food on every rooftop across New York? How many people could we feed? And these thought experiments and these concepts evolved to what we see today. And to speak on what Michael referenced, it's a common theme of creating an environment for plants to flourish where they typically cannot. Vertical farming is almost using like human ingenuity to overcome Mother Nature out of necessity, and creating these environments somewhat artificially. It's a really interesting kind of history to the whole concept.
It's a tall order trying to beat Mother Nature.
It's a tall order. Yes.
All right.
So, so moving forward now in history a little bit to kind of the early modern innovation and stuff, what we saw was vertical farming was discussed. There had been a couple modern farms built for non-cannabis crops, prior to say 2010, but it hadn't really been adopted commercially worldwide. It's been discussed for decades, but it hadn't been proven viable, this technique of cultivating indoors on multi-stacked tiers. And the engineering and the architecture and the design and even operation of these type of vertical farms just hadn't been developed yet. And it wasn't really until we saw cannabis legalization, adult use legalization around 2014, like in Colorado, that the innovation really kicked off and started escalating a lot faster. And in our opinion, it's driven by this high value of the cannabis crop. The crop itself growers were used to growing them indoors due to prohibition. It had a very high value and a high margin, especially back then, which allowed for the buffer for innovation and ingenuity, mistakes to be made in the design build phase, and still able to continue that progression forward. It was a really interesting kind of development in the history of vertical farming.
Yeah, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was kind of boots on the ground in Colorado, 2009 to 2015 during this time period. And it's exactly as you kind of describe it. This was a time where in states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, caregiver models were shifting into, kind of shifting away in some senses, and home grow, and it was now shifting into smaller warehouses. And, during this time, there was cannabis forums that you could be on, and you could learn a lot about cultivation strategies and approaches, but there really was, no one had really conquered the scale ability of indoor farming for cannabis. And the ones that had, they weren't really talking about it. So information really wasn't shared like we're doing today. And as information is shared, and people weren't touring facilities all the time. So it was a little bit more of a hush time. And as Anders was highlighting, God, did we make a lot of mistakes. We had to figure out stuff on our own. You were kind of hobbling things together, partially from the hydroponic store, partially from Home Depot, partially from Uline, or whatever you could afford around you. And so in my situation,
or whatever vendors were willing to work with you at that time, it was still somewhat taboo.
Yeah, that's true too. And so, yeah, when you went to go search the internet for solutions, it's not quite like today where you have, options, and people that really want to earn your business. And so a lot of people fell into the category that I did. My company was Kind Love in Denver, Colorado. We found out in 2009, and we had a 5,000 square foot warehouse and a 7,500 square foot warehouse. And at that time, that felt very large and monstrous. But the reality was we were trying to do a whole lot in a very small space. And so inevitably, you start to look at, and right away, we got to multi-tier. We started double stacking a long time ago. And we said, okay, this works for our veg. We know this from clone and propagation. And so for most growers, to go from double, triple, quadruple stacking your clone to double stacking or even triple stacking your veg, it really wasn't a far stretch of imagination. You could kind of get there. At this time, LEDs weren't really a thing. There was a couple on the market, but they weren't seemingly viable and definitely not accepted by the industry. So at this time, in the vegetative stage of multi-tiered work, we were predominantly using T5 fluorescent lights, which, grew great plants. But, in that close proximity, the form factor made sense on the T5 because it had a low profile, but it also put off a lot of heat. And so with stacking came additional challenges. And, at the time, we weren't even considering multi-tier and flower. It just wasn't really even a thought. But the rationale at the time was, if we could minimize our vegetative footprint, but still maintain our plant capacity and maintain our flower rooms, that we could then free up critical floor space for other things. It might be more mothers for diversity of genetics, or just more space to work in. And so, yeah, early on, this was a time where there weren't a lot of big investors in the industry. A lot of people were bootstrapping. They were building stuff that honestly probably would have never passed code if they had to, go through another inspection or something. But that was kind of this era. There was a lot of lessons learned.
Yeah, and this is to give people a time reference. This is around 2010 to 2015-ish. A lot of grow room designs at that time were static, stationary, single tier benches with HPS lights. There was very even little single tier rolling benches until the GGS, kind of rolling benches came into the scene. And during that kind of 2013, 2015, era, is when you started seeing growers looking at horticultural systems and practices and adopting them, because now they had access to those vendors and that technology could kind of work more in the open. And so you started seeing growers move away from, plywood 2x4 benches or cinder blocks and doing professional single tier rolling benches, getting more room utilization out of these spaces, optimizing the space. They were understanding that as an importance of the design. And that was kind of that first step. Another thing I found really interesting during this time frame was the multi-tier veg was the predominant vertical room growers were choosing to go up in, but it was almost out of necessity because a lot of facilities at that time undersized their veg space. And as you said it, I think recently, Michael, it's like they kind of had no choice. It was a Band-Aid solution at that time to go up, in veg spaces, because they had undersized it. It created a bottleneck for them. And even during this time, there was maybe 3 or 4 growers in cannabis actually running multi-tier flower rooms. There really weren't many. Almost all of them were mother and veg spaces. And it really wasn't until, like you said, the LEDs became more widely adopted that growers were considering multi-tier in other spaces. But at this time, even the vertical mobile racks were pretty rudimentary. A lot of casters and V-tracks and, DIY kind of pallet racking solutions. So it was pretty interesting. It was really interesting to see how, as people started adopting these things further, the trajectory of vertical farming and vertical mobile racks really followed the trajectory and adoption of LED lighting. And so now we kind of move to the next era in time in this progression and innovation of vertical farming, the early adopters. We had people testing the waters prior to this. It wasn't considered a solution for every new build, but now we're in this era of, say, 2015 to 2019-ish. Larger racking manufacturers began entering the space. Pipp entered horticulture space in 2017, with a lot of installs happening in 2018. Their racks, Pipp's racks, are very accustomed to horticulture in terms of supporting the weight and adapting to this application. We saw some of the first, flower rooms, like more flower rooms being installed during this time. Fog City Farms, for example, in 2017. They were a pioneering facility out of Santa Cruz, proving out the vertical mobile racking. They got a lot of media attention with their install, and it got a lot of other cultivators looking at that as, hey, I need to look into this a little closer. There were just so many kind of early adopters that helped pioneer this.
This is also a time where the concept of going on a cannabis cultivation tour was like pretty common. And James of Fog City Farms was probably one of the stronger tour leaders there for a while. And Anders, we've talked about this before. There's always some naysayers in the cannabis industry of like, oh, I'll never. I mean, I remember when we had our booths in 2013 with Greenhouse, there was no competition in the vertical farming space. Growers would come by, kind of look everything up and down and say, yeah, I'll never use that. I'm single tier HPS, and I crush it. And I said, that's awesome. While other growers would look at it and say, gosh, that might actually be really helpful in my veg. Or they'd start asking me questions about what I thought about the potential of double stacking mothers as an example, and keeping smaller to medium-sized mothers versus traditionally at the time was larger mothers, older mothers. And you fast forward years later, see the same people at the trade shows that said they would never ever go vertical, and they're now some of Pipp's largest clients. So it's always interesting what someone will say they won't do upfront, but then it stirs curiosity, I think, with your typical grower. And as these growers were going on these tours, and yeah, they were hesitant about vertical farming, but they were curious. And then they would go to, let's say, a Fog City Farms, or an Outco, or a Tokyo Starfish, and they would basically say, wow, they're growing a lot better product than I thought they were. And like most growers, they're like, I can do it better. And so there's that natural kind of competition within your average grower of I'm going to do it better. And I think that really pushed curiosity. And that's when we started seeing like adoption into single tier facilities. It wouldn't be the whole facility, but they're like, I want to do a double stack room to play with and like work out some of my ideas. So we saw a big kind of influx of people basically R&Ding in flower multi-tiered settings.
Well, and this was also a time where, the building codes and the regulators and inspectors were getting more savvy to vertical racking, and they were starting to develop, preferences around how to regulate and permit these type of builds. You started seeing contractors getting more savvy with installing all of the ancillary systems in these spaces, how to run irrigation, how to run power into these mobile racks, how to do drainage out of the room. That was really, people were starting to figure out how to build these rooms better as well. And as they were getting constructed better, they were performing better in terms of plant or cultivation KPIs. And that was what started garnering more attention. I mean, now in this era of, around 2018, 2019, we're not talking 3 or 4 facilities in the country that are multi-stacked. We're talking what? Hundreds. Yeah, at this point. So there's a lot more data, a lot more experience, along with vertical racks, but also LEDs. And so it was really exploding at this time very quickly, and a lot of things were being learned. So, yeah.
I do believe that the catalyst that really launched 2015 was pretty directly correlated, and it very well could have been someone else, but maybe a little bit later. But the first one out the gate that I think really changed the potential for vertical farming in flower was when a lighting company, which was called BML, rebranded to Fluence. And when they came out with that first spider light with a low profile, no fans on it, and a full spectrum white light LED, that grabbed a lot of cultivators' attention. And they basically were like, I want to play with that. And so we saw this I want to play with that mentality. And then you fast forward 2018, okay, I proved that concept, and now I'm designing a completely bespoke facility around something that I wasn't even considering 3 years ago. We've talked about this a lot. We probably talk about this every time we see each other, Anders. But one of the big restrictions to vertical farming, where some people say, "Oh, it doesn't work," or whatever they might say, it's never the fault of the rack or the light in most cases, and it's almost 90% of the time it is an issue with the mechanical engineering associated with controlling the environment, specifically humidification. Can you talk about that a little bit, Anders, and some of those differences in single tier and multi-tiered environment?
Yeah, absolutely. After touring, I think the last couple of years I've been to a little over 100 indoor grow facilities, constantly on the road. And I take the vitals of every room and facility I go to, KPIs, how they're constructed. And it's interesting to me as a cultivator and someone who is very interested in the design and operation of these spaces. And common theme I see is that the greatest limiting factor for good yields, good plant health, good phenotypic expression in these rooms is lack of environmental control. And when I say that, I mean, HVAC systems, dehumidification, and airflow. And you can't have one weak link. It's just like when you talk about nutrition for plants or growing a plant, the greatest limiting factor is going to set your ceiling for success. And so as more vertical rooms were being built, engineers were also learning more about the loads that these canopies produced in terms of the transpiration rates, the latent loads, and what dehumidification capacity was required. Not only quantifying the loads, but also how do we supply the right systems and control them and design the ductwork so that this whole system makes sense and works together symbiotically. And there were a number of rooms I went into where the units were sized appropriately. They had the capacity on paper, but the installation lacked some nuance in terms of where does the air come into the room and where does it exit. Or maybe they got all of that right, but within the room itself, they lacked airflow devices within the space, because you can't rely on HVAC systems to move air through your racks. And so that's when you started seeing, especially today, as we kind of move through this to like maybe the 2020 to 2022 era, that's when we saw a lot of innovation on ancillary equipment and services to these rooms to improve some of these things that we had learned prior. So we saw purpose-built HVAC systems with integrated hot gas reheat and dehumidification, much better suited to these spaces in terms of modulating controls, sensors. They're not running off thermostats on the wall, they're running off canopy sensors in the room. And we also started seeing in-rack airflow, purpose-built in-rack airflow systems such as vertical air solutions. Like we mentioned before, at James and Fog City Farms, he had been operating one of these double stacked flower rooms for years, and very quickly he realized he needed a purpose-built airflow solution to move air through the racks, that the ACs are just not enough, and it's really not their job to do that. And so him and his partner, Matt Bogner, created Vertical Air Solutions, and it was later acquired by Pipp in 2020 as an in-rack airflow system that you see here in these pictures. Inline fans, ductwork, moving air through the canopy. We also saw developments for, further than the environmental control side, little nuances in the, how do you work in these spaces? How do we make the labor more efficient? How do we make employees happier working in a multi-tier room? We also developments in the racks themselves, like track free, the tracks on the floors. Now is an option to remove those if you wanted, to have a little bit more flexibility walking in and out of these aisles. And Michael, I know that you were pretty involved in the development of the Elevate platform system as well. You're big into labor efficiency. One of my favorite comments you've ever made to me is value added touch versus non-value added touches in these spaces. And how do we limit the number of times we touch these plants in every growth cycle? And how do we make it easier to make these touches as well?
Totally. And it was a black eye for a while, right? It's like, how do you access the top tier? And we saw people getting really creative. I mean, I've seen, and some people prefer certain things. Even they've worked with Elevate and they go, we like our scaffolding. And so every grower and operation kind of has their preferences. It depends on how much space they have available, what their budget is. And there's a lot of opinions out there. And I think that's what makes cannabis so fascinating, is there's no shortage of opinions on the right way to do something. But I've seen everything from people using drywall stilts, ladders, rolling, locking, U-line platform ladders. But it was a pain. And so when I talk to people that have adopted the Elevate system when I'm on the road, so without any prep or anything, they all almost say the same thing. And the word is game changer. That's how they refer to it. They're like, this is a game changer for us. Instead of having, only opening up one row to service, one side of the canopy and then the other side of the canopy, they can now run two of the Elevate systems, flank the canopy that they're working on, put workers on both sides, and really reduce tasks dramatically while improving safety, while improving ergonomics. And I remember talking, and I'm not against single tier cultivation, HPS. I've seen incredible things. I think we'll talk a little bit in a little bit about some of the metrics and numbers there. But one of my arguments to my single tier grower buddies would be, they're like, oh, I don't want to use a ladder or a lift. And I would say, you're growing a 7-foot tall plant on a mobile bench. You're at 9 feet at the top of your canopy. You're using step ladders. You're already doing it. You're already not on the ground. So it was always interesting to hear that comment. So that was kind of always my rebuttal back. But yeah, in terms of value adding touches and devalue adding touches, as we see these markets compress in the cannabis space, I think people are taking a look at their labor, which is clearly their biggest cost by far. And also one that if you're not in control of it can get away from you really quickly and surprise you. It's not like your electric or utility bill, which is relatively fixed and you can kind of plan for it. Sometimes there's ebbs and flows to labor that creep up on operators. But yeah, I think you have to look at how can I do this faster, smarter, leaner, safer, and more ergonomic without totally destroying my workforce. That's another thing too, is people get burned out a lot in cultivation. And so if they're having to, sweat for 7 or 8 hours a day while overbending and stretching and exerting themselves, and if you could just alleviate some of that unergonomic design, it makes a dramatic improvement to employee morale, which translates directly to productivity.
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head too, as we come to kind of shifting the conversation of vertical farming today. It's the name of the game today. As we saw last year, the price per pound went low. It's becoming much more competitive as more and more markets are opening, and production is at an all-time high in a lot of these more mature states. The name of the game today is efficiency, operating lean. And what I've noticed and what I see is a common thing discussed today in vertical farming facilities and single tier facilities is quantifying the performance metrics of these facilities, especially on vertical farms. As someone who is so used to single tier and is looking at multi-tier today, when you're building a new facility today, you have to consider a vertical approach. Like, there's no question about it. And people like us and other operators in the space are trying to put numbers to that to increase the confidence, because it's crazy. What was it, Michael? A couple of years ago, historically, we did see somewhat lower yields out of multi-tier flower rooms just because things were still being innovated and learned.
If you think about all the factors, about all the factors involved, new facility, let's say it's a new state, new facility, new laws, new building, new equipment, new team. It takes a while to dial all that in. New technology, that LED lighting was newish. A lot of people cranked them up, fried their plants, and then became like photon afraid, if you will, that they were going to continue that. So I watched a lot of people then, really dim their lights down for quite a while. And so because of, the reactions they had, they didn't quite understand all the other components that you need to ramp up when you ramp up lighting like that. But now, fast forward a bit, and people have had enough time to play with things, work out the kinks, destroy a crop or two in some cases. And now they're pushing the envelope of what's possible more and more. So I think where we traditionally saw, let's say it used to be like a 30 to 60 gram kind of per square foot kind of metric, we're now seeing, good operators with good experience and good genetics, importantly, pushing, 60, 80 plus grams per square foot in a multi-tiered environment. That's per tier.
Per tier. And we were at a facility a week ago in LA, and they were pushing 60 to 80 grams every single harvest, time after time, in a
no matter what they grew.
space. No matter what they grew, they had 30 cultivars in that room, 3 tiers high, and they were hitting 60, 80 grams every single harvest out of, I think, 6 different rooms. It was really interesting to see. And I think what we saw was growers were learning how to do LEDs, learning how to go vertical. The facilities were getting more engineers involved on the HVAC side, environmental control. And what we're seeing today now is more balance in all of these systems. Growers are figuring out the balance. Design builders are figuring out the balance of how to build and size these systems and operate these rooms. And we're seeing that in the yield metrics today. Little nuanced things about how much space do I need in the front of the room? How long do I want my racks? How far do I want that air to travel in these rooms? We've built enough facilities now to learn these lessons. And with the information sharing available today, people are learning from it. And they're saying, okay, maybe I want to limit the racking length to less than 50 feet. Or maybe I want 5 feet in between my tiers. Or I want 6 feet in front of my racks to make sure I have good air mixing. All these little lessons are being learned by investors and by operators and builders. And it's the proof is in the pudding when it comes to the performance of these rooms. There's just a higher level of confidence. One interesting thing I did see was a theme early on was we call it lovingly a CFO grow versus a cultivator grow.
Yeah, cultivator grow.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I'd be happy to. I might be guilty
Okay.
of coin naming that one too. But it's not uncommon. We look at hundreds of drawings, in a given month, and so when you get that first drawing and an architect's already been working on it and they've laid out racking, it's really clear when there's a non-grower involved, or maybe the grower's voice got muted potentially. So I would refer to as, a CFO design or an investor design. And what I'm referring to is they will cram as much square footage of racking and trays as humanly possible in a cultivation space. And though on paper, financially, it looks really nice, the reality of operating in a space where you don't have room to work and plants don't have room to, breathe, so to speak, or air exchange doesn't have that capacity, it causes a bunch of problems, increases labor, it decreases plant potential. And so, we refer to something like that as a CFO or an investor kind of dictated design, where a cultivator or grower design, they're really thinking about, okay, I'm the one that has to work inside this space. How is this going to flow? What does it look like when I'm turning over a room? What does it look like when I'm harvesting? What does it look like when I'm defoliation? What does scouting look like? And so, a good grower is really trying to work through these workflows, and they're making sure that they have ample space, not just for people, but also for the plant as well, and the HVAC equipment around it. There's also another style. There's another theme. I'm big into themes and pattern recognition. And so another theme I see is you walk into a cultivation flowering room today or in the last 7 years. And the one that we were in outside of LA last week, Anders, you walked in the room, it's like what I would refer to as like a minimalistic design, which is a little bit more where I lean towards. There wasn't a bunch of technology everywhere. It was very basic. They focused primarily on HVAC, in-rack air distribution. They had racking and they had LED lights, but there wasn't a lot of other bells and whistles. All the HVAC wasn't inside the room. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, I've walked into grow rooms in the last 7 years, and it's almost like they went to MJBizCon, grabbed like a card from every person that sold like an ancillary product, and they basically bolted it to the wall. And a lot of times those systems, they're not designed to be integrated. So you kind of have things working against each other. In some cases, you have some things that are, I don't want to say snake oil, but they're just not functioning at the level that you thought they were. And so there's a lot of different approaches here, but that is a common theme. You walk into a room and it's almost like going to like my Italian grandma's house where she has to put a picture frame on every bare wall versus going into like a modern structure where it's, more minimalistic. And so, there's some interesting trends and decisions that people make. A lot of times when we get called in to do turnaround work or consulting and vertical farming optimization, we end up ripping a lot of the stuff out of their room and kind of stripping it down, kind of like a race car, if you will.
Well, it's like in the past, a lot of vertical rooms were built, they were injected into a single tier room. So it was in a room that was designed for single tier, and then they retrofitted it and put multi-tier racks in that space. Today, we're seeing rooms built around a multi-tier strategy with the HVAC sized appropriately for amount of canopy in the space, the latent load for the LED, what the LEDs are producing, and the transpiration rates in the crop. We're seeing it more purpose built for these spaces. And the controls and automations are getting a lot better as well. We're able to remove a lot of the wires and cables hanging all over. It's becoming more intelligent controls and automation that you don't see as more prevalent in the space. It's kind of behind the scenes. And that kind of,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to kind of transition to where we are today, but kind of what we're seeing now more into the future, but go ahead.
I was going to say something that's interesting. I know this talk is a lot around cannabis and vertical farming, but something that I was a bit surprised at, I was doing a podcast with Planet Detroit, which is a leafy green company, non-cannabis in Detroit. And they said that because of the cannabis industry and making these new innovative products and also making the price point more affordable, that if it wasn't for the cannabis industry, they would have not been able to afford the vertical racking solution that they have from Pipp today. So I thought it was really interesting. A lot of times in the cannabis industry, there's kind of like a green wash or a green tax. So if you're talking like a horticultural company or an agricultural company and they say cannabis, it's almost like you're getting a little bit of a price increase because you're cannabis, and they think that cannabis operators, are just sitting on piles of money. And so I had always thought that, I always ask for horticultural pricing. I'm like, don't give me the tomato pricing, don't give me the cannabis pricing when talking to vendors in some cases. But in this scenario, the cannabis industry is actually helping non-cannabis farms be able to afford and also have solutions that they're looking for. And I thought that was really fascinating.
I mean, it really is. We're seeing essentially the lessons learned in cannabis being translated now to non-cannabis indoor, vertical farms growing things like leafy greens and strawberries and herbs. And they've learned those lessons with a lower margin crop. They couldn't afford the innovation that cannabis cultivators really did. So in this broad spectrum of the evolution of vertical farming, cannabis legalization plays a very strong role in allowing for these things to be learned and figured out. And just the amount of installs, like you said, drove some of the costs down so that non-cannabis crops can also afford these systems. They feel confident in them. They understand, how these buildings are constructed. And it's paving the way for other plants to be grown indoors. And it's kind of closing the loop, coming full circle to where we started around, the history of vertical farming, of these things that we're now coming back to the food, locating these facilities closer to dense urban areas, limiting that food mile distance of transport, and they're just becoming much more efficient. That kind of brings us to today. They now have access to these equipment and systems, and so we're going to be seeing more, transitioning to predictions for the future. I think one of the first things we're seeing is that a wider variety of crops are going to be grown indoors beyond cannabis. Right now, we're seeing a lot of interest around strawberries, potted herbs, basil. More and more of that, I think, will be moved indoors just out of necessity, especially in the Middle East. There's a lot of interest in vertical farming in the Middle East, growing vertically in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, just because they can't grow those crops year round, and the transportation costs are getting so much more expensive, as we saw throughout COVID, of moving from where these plants are grown to where the consumer are is getting more expensive, and fuel costs are going up. And so people are sitting there going, I can build and grow these crops indoors a lot cheaper, and it's a better investment than having to pay a continual freight cost of bringing these crops in from other countries, other areas. Let's just grow it here in the desert. It's like full circle back to these hanging gardens of Babylon. It's like we're doing it again now, just with much higher technology and way higher, plant production and output.
Yeah.
What other things do you see kind of coming for the future of vertical farming?
You hit it on the head. I think people are realizing today more than ever how unstable our food supply chain actually is. And with our ever-growing population, there's some really difficult challenges to overcome. And I lived in Santa Cruz and I worked in Salinas for a while in California, and that area is like the lettuce bowl of America. And so I would travel. So it was interesting. They said that the average head of lettuce travels over 2,000 miles until it gets to its final destination. And, as you kind of travel from west to east and you take a look at certain produce, like lettuce as an example, it looks great on the West Coast, and you kind of get to Colorado and it's kind of a little more shoddy, and you get to the East Coast and it can actually, look pretty rough. And so I think hopefully for the future, and it's a quote from Pasona Urban Farm in Japan, but they predict that food will be grown within feet of where people who eat it. And they are looking at underground solutions. They're looking at utilizing all kinds of different pockets, but the idea of bringing certain food in more of a localized standpoint, I think is important, in reducing those food miles that you highlighted.
What about in cannabis? What do you see the progression of vertical farming going in the cannabis?
Yeah,
real quick.
Where I think it's going to go, or maybe I guess I'll say where I'd like it to go, is I anticipate that I refer to any cultivation facility, single tier or multi-tier, as a labor labyrinth. You got to go into the system, you got to do the work, you got to bring it out. So I predict that we'll see more of a kind of a Toyota model, bring the work to the workers. So between the implementation of AI and a lot of the robotics that exist today, as far as box picking robotics and things like that, I anticipate that you'll be able to call trays from whatever tier, whatever room, whatever level, and a bot will go grab those for you, bring those to a centralized head house or processing building where workers will be basically in line. And those workers possibly could be fully automated robotics as well. And they will work on the plant as needed, and then it'll send it back, or they'll harvest the plant and it'll all flow. So we've seen this in Dutch horticulture for years now. Very common in an orchid facility. You go into an orchid facility, they generally have an overhead tram, grabs big trays, brings them to a centralized head house. You go in a big greenhouse, hundreds of thousands of square feet. There's not one worker inside the actual greenhouse. And as we've talked about before, we are the virus. We are the spreader of the disease. So humans tend to spread pests or bring pests in. So the more that we can do to keep the human interaction, which I know sounds so sacrilegious to some extent, but keeping the human interaction minimized between the plants, I think we'll see a lot less disease, pest, or the use of pesticides, the use of biologicals.
Yeah. Well, and I think because of that automation that is inevitably going to be more and more integrated into these facilities, we'll start seeing more tiers in cannabis going higher, even more vertically, occupying that cubic footage. I often see these warehouses with really high ceiling heights, even in vertical facilities, and they're not occupying all the way as high as they can. I think with more automation, we'll see larger racking heights, more tiers beyond 2 to 3 that we see in flower. We'll probably see closer to 4 and 5 as the automation comes to be adapted. But I do think a lot of that is predicated on banking reform at the federal level. Having these cannabis operators have more traditional access to capital, loans, construction loans, will help spur, I think, this next phase in the evolution of vertical farming to be able to have the CapEx and budget required to afford some of these more highly automated technical systems. And so I think that's going to be a roadblock before we see some of that is banking reform for cannabis specifically. But in the meantime, I think we're going to see a lot of innovation on the non-cannabis side, and then mushrooms too. I think we're going to see a lot of mushrooms grown indoors. From a biologist standpoint, I think it'd be really cool, and I will probably be built in the future, is conjunction of mushroom cultivation and plant growth, because they're so symbiotic in nature in terms of, CO2 release and CO2 capture, oxygen release, oxygen capture. They work very synergistically together. And, I don't know about the viability of that, but I'm sure people are going to try it out and see if they can limit their CO2 and supplementation costs and amounts by growing crops symbiotically together, maybe doing air exchanges between rooms, or who knows. But regardless, mushroom cultivation is going to be a lot more prevalent.
Yeah, I think that mushroom cultivation is definitely the future, and it's partially the now. And from a biology standpoint, we're talking about feeding populations, but you're not going to do that on kale, salad, and some other of these things. There's a lot more that we need to bring into vertical farming, and I think you'll see that. And biologically speaking, there's no reason why you can't have fruit trees vertically farmed. If you look at a lot of fruit trees now, the French technique, espalier, they're basically training and manipulating apple trees and stone fruits to basically be grown multi-tier. They'll spread them out, they'll top them. I mean, there's some apple farms out there that hover like 1 to 2 feet off the ground, and they're laying it out like this. So, I think
that kind of genetics then is really the next step too for a lot of that.
Yeah, the key will be pollination with that. Utilizing commercial bees indoors has got some work-throughs. It is done in strawberries and in Japan, so it's definitely viable, but that will be one of the challenges there.
Anything else you want to add before we move on to some Q&A?
Yeah, I'd say let's jump into Q&A. It seems to be the most interesting part for most people. So yeah, with that, I want to thank you guys for listening in today, and we'll turn it over.
Thank you both. This is very, very educational, and lots of really interesting things happening in the vertical farming space. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop those into the Q&A box below. We'll have Michael and Anders answer those live. But I do have a couple of questions from my end just to get this going. So aren't flower yields, and we're specifically talking grams per square foot, typically lower in multi-tier rooms compared to single level rooms?
It depends on the cultivator, but I would say that you could make a stronger argument for that, maybe 2015, 2016. But as Anders and I were highlighting, we're not seeing that anymore. So I would say that, you know, some of the better growers that I know are somewhere between 80 and maybe even upwards to 120 grams per square foot on a single tier. And mind you, they're growing almost a 7 or 8 foot tall plant. We're now achieving that single tier under LED in a multi-tiered environment. So if we go to 2 tiers at 80 grams per square foot, we're at 160 grams per square foot in that same cultivation space. And so I've yet to see a single tiered, I'll say HPS or LED grower hitting 160 grams a square, essentially in the same, in the same space.
Anders, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, that was a spot on answer. I think beyond that, whether you're looking at yields from a 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional way, it's also what is the cost of doing that. So you're able to produce a higher level of output in a smaller square footage. And so your fixed cost of production are lower at times for certain line items. And so you're able to get more production with less in. And so that is sustainable and efficient. So you're getting more production with less put into the system.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to calculate that, but like, let's say you wanted to have 2 single tier rooms right next to each other, that's pretty much double the cost. But if you go to a second tier within a space, there of course is additional costs, but it's not double. And you can even look at
every room you grow plants in has an inherent cost to build it, right? You need every individual space. And so if you're able to limit those spaces or make them larger and get more canopy out of it, you reduce your CapEx and your cost per square foot to build that room. So instead of having, irrigation, fertigation, environmental controllers in twice as many rooms, now you have half of them, right? As HVAC units get bigger, their cost per ton goes down. And so it's the, efficiency of scaling is what you're benefiting from. At the same time, you're getting more per square foot. So it's, I think we're definitely looking internally at Pipp, working with some industry organizations to help further quantify that sustainability. And so that's still something we're working on today, that efficiency metrics.
Great, thanks guys. So we have a question from Brandon here. So what is the normal depth you require for the ducting between the bottom of the rack and the lights? And how do you ensure the same amount of air is dispersing at the end of the rack versus at the beginning next to the fan?
Bottom of the deck and the lights. So I think he's referring to the vertical air solutions ductwork there. And typically it's a 3-inch tall ductwork. So if you're looking at the bottom of the tier above it and the bottom of the lights, we typically estimate about 6 inches there. To accommodate for the ductwork and the lighting fixtures. It's about 6 inches. And then another great question basically was how to balance the airflow from front to back, side to side to get an even distribution of air. A lot of that comes in the design phase. So looking at your length of run, your tier elevation, and you also have to think about the density of your canopy. But a lot of that has to do with basically a lot of airflow. You get definitely a pressure dam at the end of your ductwork that helps push a lot of that velocity back, and just bouncing it through ductwork. So
what's the maximum length on VAS without additional engineering?
We don't really see anything over about, 56 feet or something like that. 60 feet is kind of the max, but I personally would like 40 feet or less if I was to build a new facility. I would like to have a row length 40 feet or less. because that is a shorter distance for air to travel through the room back from your supply to your return in a circular fashion. So what I've seen real successful is supplying the air in the front working aisle of the space, having in-rack airflow capture that dehumidified, conditioned, cooled air, pushing it to the back of the room, and having return grills at multiple elevations on the back wall and even up high, creating similar to that circular pass you see in a greenhouse type airflow pattern. And the longer that length of the row, the greater delta T you'll have from front to back. So you'll see more temperature increase from front to back if you have a longer row. And so you get a much tighter climate, less microclimates, less deviation from top to bottom, left to right, front to back, with somewhat shorter rows. Like ideally, I'd love to have 32 feet, long, or 40 feet or less, but then you can go as wide as you want. Just limit that length that the air has to pass, and you'll get way better adherence to set point in the space.
And we're going to talk a lot about this in much greater detail and nerd out, so to speak, on future webinars. So this is one of a 4-part series, if I'm not mistaken. And so we're going to go a lot deeper on this in the future this year. If you are in a situation where you have a 56-foot long run, you can also put, in this case, VAS on both sides and run a shorter distance. So you could have it on the front end and the back end, and on 56 feet, maybe you're running, whatever it is, 27, 28 foot long run instead of running like a whole 50. That way you're getting the pressurization and the airflow that you're desired.
And then having the returns in the center, you're kind of having that vortex.
And that's a big thing. That's a really critical thing too. Like a lot of in-rack air solution is only going to be as good as the HVAC supporting it, and also where that treated air is being distributed. As Anders highlighted, a good portion of people are putting the bulk of that in the front main aisle and pulling it back. And the returns also need to be located on the back wall in that case. You wouldn't want your returns located on the front or on the ceiling, because you'll get short cycling and have a lot of climate issues.
Great, thank you guys. So can vertical racking designs be used in greenhouses?
We've seen it. I know Anders has a strong opinion about it. We've seen it. We've got several Pipp clients using it. I don't see them using it in flower. A lot of them are using it in veg. And to be completely transparent, somebody made a bad engineering or calculation on plant capacity, and they got themselves in a situation similar to a lot of the growers in the early days of, I undersized my veg and therefore I cannot support my flower. And so that leaves you with a couple different options. You're either going to turn some lights off in flower, which no investor or owner wants to hear, or grower at that. Or you might have to force yourself to veg in place. So you're vegging in place in your flower room, which, it works. The problem is that you're going to end up losing a half turn or harvest, or maybe even a full harvest per year. So if you have to veg in place for 2 or 3 weeks, or even a week, that adds up over a course of time. And now you're losing total harvest per year, which has a very significant financial impact. So the cultivators that we've got using single tier, honestly, a lot of them in the greenhouse, it's predominantly veg. I've seen 3 tiers, healthy plants, but a lot of them are pulling blackout shades and treating it like an indoor room.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to dive into the metrics of it more, but from what I've seen, going vertical, especially with a high transpiration rate crop like cannabis, throws off the energy balance in a lot of the greenhouses today. So essentially there's too much load being generated by a canopy, a vertical multi-tier like cannabis canopy in a greenhouse, for the thermodynamics of the greenhouse to balance. And so what they do is they end up mechanically cooling these greenhouses, sealing them off, no passive ventilation, and pulling tarps, like light depth. But it's at that point, why don't you just build an indoor facility? At that, you've built a greenhouse, a vertical indoor greenhouse that is about the same cost per square foot as just building an indoor. And so, yeah, you might save some back on the light, the natural sunlight, but really only the top tier is going to benefit as much from that. The lower tiers are going to be shaded. So I think there's a future for it. I think there's a really interesting concept of like a hybrid indoor fully automated greenhouse, but I don't know if I don't know if vertical stack racking in a greenhouse is the right answer. Look where greenhouses are built. Typically where they're built, there's plenty of space. And so you're not as close to an urban area. The necessity for going up is less required. And so you can spread out and kind of balance all these dynamics a little bit easier.
Yeah, you don't feel the same for non-cannabis, do you?
No, for non-cannabis, I think there's a lot, like especially in strawberries, you've seen, you're talking gutters that are hung, maybe even staggered, and you get or tower cultivation. So you see a lot of leafy greens grown in these rotating towers vertically in greenhouses. That is very viable. It makes a lot of sense. But a lot of that stems back to the fact that their transpiration rates are a lot lower. And so it's easier to manage the climate indoors with those crops going vertically and maximizing that canopy than a crop like cannabis, where it's producing such a high transpiration rate and you need a lot of dehumidification. I think if you were to do that in a greenhouse, you need a really high gutter height, basically, to balance all of that.
Well, the greenhouses just seem to be getting taller and taller these days, so maybe we'll see it.
Yeah, it looks like it.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar. There's lots of great questions still available, but feel free to reach out to Anders and Michael with these questions. But before I wrap up today's webinar, I want to give you both a chance to give any shout outs, any mentions you want to do before we close things.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to Craig Umans, our fearless leader, who's been really supportive of the cannabis industry from day one. Is one of the reasons why I partnered with him with Greenhouse Industries, and just really grateful to have a team that's really passionate and educated and pushing the envelope and really trying to listen to customers and understand their needs. And for all of you that have questions that didn't get answered, Anders and I are big nerds, so we'd love to hear from you. Our contact information will be on the next slide, I'm sure. And don't hesitate to reach out. We have a lot of resources. We're not just a racking company. We offer a lot more in terms of support and needs to make sure that you feel comfortable with making decisions.
Well said. Now, I just want to thank the team at MJBiz for helping put this together, the team here at Pipp for letting Michael and I talk about something we're passionate about for the last hour. And you attendees, thanks for coming to listen, and I hope you found it useful. And like Michael said, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk further. So, and then we'll also be at Indoor AgCon in a week, and we'll be at some shows coming up. So look for us out there if you're traveling. We'd love to say hi in person as well.
Great. Well, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. And we just want to thank Pipp Horticulture again for their sponsorship in today's webinar. But thanks everybody for attending, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.